Imagine, for a second, the global economy. Now, don't picture a bunch of abstract spreadsheets or stock tickers. Instead, I want you to picture a colossal, humming engine, a machine of just almost unimaginable scale, where the lifeblood pumping through its veins is money. And the raw physical fuel that keeps the whole thing from grinding to a catastrophic halt is oil. Welcome. Today, in this explainer, we are taking a really deep, immersive dive into this hidden circulatory system that literally runs the globe. We're going to unpack the actual mechanics of power, the silent deals that dictate our everyday lives, and honestly, the fragility of a system that is currently experiencing the absolute greatest shockwaves of our lifetime. So we have to ask ourselves, what happens when the engine that runs the global economy suddenly loses its anchor and is forced to find new fuel? It's a pretty dramatic question, right? But it's exactly the reality we're facing right now. In our time together, we'll uncover how the modern world was intentionally designed back in the 1970s, decode the hidden financial plumbing built to sustain it, and finally look at the terrifying breakdown of this exact machine that's unfolding right now in the 2020s. Because as you'll see, money, power, and natural resources, they are completely and inextricably linked.
To understand today, we actually have to go back to when that engine first lost its anchor. See, for decades, the US dollar was anchored to gold under what was called the Bretton Woods system. Think of gold as this massive, heavy, immovable anchor, and the US dollar is the ship tied safely right to it. But then, in 1971, the US essentially cut the rope. The dollar was suddenly allowed to float, and predictably, its value dropped. Now, why does this matter to oil? Well, because global oil was priced in dollars. By early 1973, oil-producing nations like those in OPEC were selling the exact same amount of oil, but they were getting back these newly devalued dollars. They were literally losing wealth without doing a single thing differently. So you can imagine, the tension was just boiling. And then, in October 1973, the Yom Kippur War erupted. Arab oil producers who were already angry over Western support for Israel and super frustrated by the currency shock launched a massive oil embargo. And just like that, the world changed overnight. The impact of this was incredibly visceral. It was a literal shockwave hitting the West. Before 1973, the entire American and Western European lifestyle was engineered on the absolute foundation of cheap, endless energy. I mean, it built the sprawling suburbs, it powered these massive factories, it made everything incredibly inexpensive. But that 1973 embargo just completely shattered that illusion. Suddenly, you had massive lines at gas stations stretching for blocks, skyrocketing prices, and this really terrifying realization of extreme vulnerability. It exposed, in real time, the absolute danger of relying on foreign supply chains for the literal lifeblood of a nation's economy.
Okay, let's dive into this, because the solution to that crisis basically birthed the modern financial world as we know it. Following the shock, the U.S. struck a very quiet deal with Saudi Arabia, establishing the petrodollar system. Think of this as a massive cardiovascular system pumping wealth across the entire planet. Here's how it works. Step 1. OPEC countries agree to sell their oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. Step 2. Because of this, these countries suddenly have massive surpluses of dollars, way more than they can actually spend internally, so they recycle them. They invest these petrodollars right back into Western banks and U.S. Treasury bonds. Step 3. Western banks then take those massive deposits and lend them out to developing nations who desperately need dollars to buy that suddenly expensive oil. And just like that, the machine was humming again. To really grasp the sheer scale of this machinery, consider this warning from the head of the IMF at the time. He said they were facing their most difficult period since the 1930s. Over $100 billion in wealth was transferred. I mean, for the 1970s, that was an unprecedented geopolitical shift. If those petrodollars weren't recycled properly back into the system, the world's banks faced total global bankruptcy. The pressure to manage this vast new circulatory system of capital was just immense, and it required a deeply coordinated effort from global elites to keep the whole machine from literally tearing itself apart. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how that coordination happens. Based on academic mapping of corporate power, our sources show a transnational network of policy groups, places like the Trilateral Commission, the World Economic Forum, and the Bilderberg Conference. Academics argue these groups represent a transnational capitalist class. They essentially serve as the engineers of this global machine. They bring together corporate directors, politicians, and intellectuals to build consensus, to figure out how to manage these massive petrodollar flows, and to promote a globally integrated free market economy. Basically, a framework where capital flows freely across borders with minimal state interference. They're the ones ensuring the plumbing stays intact. But we have to ask, how did we really get there? When looking at the origins of that 1973 crisis, the historical sources actually divide into two very distinct camps. The traditionalist view points to standard macroeconomics, right? Booming Western demand, declining domestic U.S. oil production, and supply shortages triggered by geopolitical conflict. Pretty straightforward. However, the opposing side details a conspiracy view. This much more radical theory argues the crisis wasn't a natural shortage at all. Instead, it was an engineered event by the U.S. government and major oil companies to intentionally spike prices, reestablish their monopoly power, and actively crush the competing economies of Europe and Japan. It's absolutely vital to see how both standard economics and this deep skepticism have fundamentally shaped the narrative of oil.
And this skepticism extends directly to how the petrodollar system is maintained today, fueling the highly controversial theory of petrodollar warfare. Now, this is the perspective that the US dollar's supreme status, being the exclusive currency for global oil, isn't just some convenient economic arrangement. Our sources note critics view it as an imperial one, ruthlessly enforced by military interventions against any nation, like Iraq or Libya, that even attempts to sell oil in other currencies. Whether you view this system as just a foundational economic pillar or a violently guarded monopoly, it really highlights the perceived sky-high stakes of the oil-dollar connection. Which brings our thriller right into the present day, June 2024. This date is massive. It marks the 50-year expiration of that original, highly secretive agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia that literally birthed the petrodollar system. And the absolutely crucial detail here? Saudi Arabia did not renew it. Let that sink in. The foundational anchor chain that tied the world's most vital commodity exclusively to the US dollar was suddenly unmoored. As of that moment, the machinery officially entered completely uncharted territory. So the crucial point is what happens next. Fast forward to early 2025. Regional conflict leads Iran to close the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if you're not familiar, this is the world's most critical energy choke point. Instantly, 20% of the global oil supply is choked off from the market. 20%. If petrodollar recycling was the cardiovascular system, this was a massive, paralyzing heart attack. The economic model of the Gulf countries ground to a halt practically overnight, and the global engine was instantly starved of its fuel. And right in the middle of this intense supply crisis, a really bizarre statistical anomaly occurred. Over the span of just 30 days, oil facilities in Texas, Australia, Mexico, Ecuador, India, and Myanmar all caught fire. Now, officially, authorities labeled these as just a sheer coincidence of simultaneous technical faults. Nothing to see here. However, our sources highlight that the timing, occurring precisely as the global petrodollar system fractured and supply was incredibly squeezed, has fueled intense online speculation. There are massive theories of intentional sabotage, suggesting these were designed to engineer even higher prices in a collapsing system. The result of all this is what policymakers are officially calling the largest energy crisis in modern history. And the really terrifying thing about energy crises is that they operate with a lag. The barrels of oil that didn't ship through the Strait of Hormuz in March, they didn't just vanish silently. They cascaded through the system. They manifested as gasoline shortages in April, diesel shortages in May, and by 2026, the lack of cheap energy translates into massive fertilizer price spikes, hitting global agriculture right during planting season. The breakdown of this abstract financial machine suddenly and very violently affects the price of the actual food on your own dinner table. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it shows that survival in this new era comes down to exactly one thing: energy sovereignty. Look at the real-time fallout in Europe in 2026. Spain and Italy have very similar climates, but because Spain spent the previous few years aggressively building out domestic solar and wind power, their forecast power price sat around 66 euros per megawatt hour. Italy, however, had remained heavily dependent on imported gas. Their citizens, they ended up paying nearly double. It is a stark, mathematically undeniable proof that relying on vulnerable international supply strings is basically an economic death sentence during a global shock. Let's move on and see how this builds, because this crisis has forced a great global pivot. It's completely exposed a fundamental asymmetry in how we generate power. Think about it. Fossil fuel dependency requires permanent, recurring reliance on foreign choke points. You literally need a new shipment of gas every single day to run a gas plant. But the transition to renewable and nuclear baseloads, that is front-loaded. Yes, it absolutely takes massive upfront materials, but once a solar farm or a nuclear reactor is actually built on your own soil, it provides domestic resilience for decades. And it does it without needing an oil tanker to try and safely navigate a war zone.
This crisis is actively accelerating a panicked global rush toward this kind of domestic sovereignty.
But as we close this explainer, we really have to look ahead. We are currently rushing to replace oil with critical minerals like copper, cobalt, and lithium to build all our new solar panels and batteries. So I want to leave you with this. As the old machine breaks down and we scramble to build a new one, are we actually liberating the global economy? Or, by trading Middle Eastern oil routes for global mineral supply chains, are we simply forging a brand new set of chains and choke points for the 21st century? It's a lot to think about. Keep questioning the system.